She married him because she believed he was homeless, penniless, and completely alone. She gave him a roof when he had nowhere to sleep, food when he couldn't afford a meal, and finally her hand in marriage when everyone around her called her a fool. But just 3 days after their wedding, a convoy of black luxury cars surrounded her tiny house. Men in expensive suits stepped out, lowered their heads to her husband and called him Sir. She froze. The man sleeping beside her wasn't homeless. He wasn't poor, and when he finally told her who he really was and why he had chosen her, her entire world turned upside down. The rain started somewhere over Montesano and hadn't let up by the time my shift finally ended. I watched it through the window of a rideshare, streaks of light sliding sideways across the glass, and let myself feel for the first time in 16 hours how tired I actually was. Crestview does that to you on a night like this one. I'd held pressure on a gunshot wound, talked a scared 17-year-old through her first seizure, sat with a woman in the family consultation room while she absorbed the fact that her husband wasn't coming home. I was good at that part, the sitting with people. 8 years in, and it still cost me something every single time. But I'd take that cost over the alternative every time. My grandmother used to say, some people are born to fix what's broken. And I'd decided a long time ago I'd rather spend my life patching people up than spend it wishing I knew how. By the time my shift ended, I didn't have much left, besides the drive to get to my own bed. Most nights I'd have caught the bus down the mountain to 5 Points. But a security guard walked me out to my pickup spot after a patient's brother took a swing at an orderly. And by the time the app found me a driver, arguing with anyone, even myself, felt like too much work. I did math instead. The same math I did most nights since my brother Dale moved in with me, one more semester of his tuition at Calhoun. The transmission that needed replacing before it stranded me somewhere. The credit card balance I kept rounding down to the nearest 50, so it wouldn't feel as bad as it actually was. Numbers had a way of following me home, even when I wanted them to stay in the parking garage. Dale kept telling me he'd pay me back once he graduated, and I kept telling him I wasn't keeping a tally. Both of us knew that wasn't entirely true, and both of us let it go anyway, the way family does. Rough one? The driver asked, glancing at me in the mirror. Long one, I said, which wasn't really an answer. It was all I had. We took the switchbacks down off the mountain slow, the way you do in weather like that. Headlights catching the rain in long silver lines, guardrail on one side and dark trees on the other. I almost missed him. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I think about it. How close I came to just riding past. It was a single shoe that caught my eye first, sitting upright on the shoulder like someone had set it there. Past it half in the gravel and half on the road, a shape that didn't belong, a person. Stop the car, I said. What? Stop the car! Please, now. He pulled over fast enough that my seatbelt caught me across the chest, and I was out the door before we'd fully stopped. Rain soaking through my scrubs in the seconds it took to reach him. He was face down, one arm bent underneath him at an angle that made my stomach turn. I got 2 fingers against his throat and found a pulse. Fast, but there. Sir, can you hear me? I turned him as gently as I could, supporting his neck, my hands finding the calm my heart hadn't caught up to yet. I need you to open your eyes for me. Blood ran pink down the side of his face, thinned by the rain. Under all of it, he had a kind face. I don't know why that was the thing I noticed, kneeling in the mud with a stranger's blood on my hands. But I did. Something steady in the bones of it, even unconscious, even broken. A gash split his hairline, deep enough it would need stitches. His shirt had torn at the shoulder and even soaked through and streaked with mud. It was good enough fabric that some small, useless part of my brain noted it probably cost more than my rent. Mom, is he breathing? The driver had come around the car, hovering at the edge of the headlights. He's breathing. I need your help getting him into the car. Dispatch would be slammed on a night like this, every low spot flooding, every downed line between here and Governor's Drive competing for the same trucks. We weren't waiting out here for one. Back seat. Please, now. We got him up between us. his feet dragging uselessly through the wet grass, and he was heavier than he looked. All of his weight pulling at my shoulder while I talked to him the whole way, low and steady. The way I talk to every patient, whether they can hear me or not. You're okay. I've got you. We're almost there. That was when his eyes opened. I've done this job 8 years, and I still wasn't ready for it. The way his eyes found mine in the dark. Clear and startlingly present, like whatever had happened to the rest of him hadn't managed to touch whatever was still awake behind his face. His hand closed around my wrist. Not rough, just certain, in a way that didn't match a man who could barely lift his head. Please, his voice broke on the word, barely more than breath. Don't tell anyone you found me. You're in shock. Try to save your energy. I can't go back there. His fingers tightened, and there was something in his face that had nothing to do with the pain of his body. Something older and more tired than that. Please, not yet. I just need a little time. Then his eyes slipped shut and his hand went slack, and he was gone again before I could ask him anything at all. Before I could ask what there meant, or who he was so afraid of finding him. The driver looked at me over the roof of the car. What did he say? Just that he's scared, I said, which was true, if not the whole truth. Drive, Crestview, the ER bay around back. I'll direct you. The 11 minutes it took to get down the mountain were the longest of my whole shift. I kept 2 fingers against his pulse and my eyes on his face, and I couldn't stop turning his words over. Not don't tell anyone I'm hurt. Not don't tell anyone where I am. Don't tell anyone you found me. Like the finding itself was the dangerous part. I looked down at him once, at the rise and fall of his chest, steadier now than it had been on the roadside. And something in me settled just slightly, the way it does when a patient starts fighting for you instead of against you. We pulled into the ambulance bay, and I was out of the car calling for a gurney before we'd fully stopped. Found down off the mountain road, unresponsive on scene, briefly responsive during transport, I said, falling into the rhythm without thinking, even though tonight I was the bystander, not the staff. Head lack, possible fracture left forearm, vitals stable at pickup. Dr. Aldretti didn't look up from what her hands were already doing. Babe, got it, thank you, Birch. Then it wasn't my hands on him anymore. It was hers, and Priya's, and 3 other people I'd trained beside for years. All of them moving with the same steady urgency. I'd used on strangers 100 times. Before. Except tonight I was the one standing outside the curtain instead of behind it. You're off the clock. Priya draped a blanket over my shoulders without asking. My scrubs were soaked through, my hands still unsteady, and I couldn't have told you if that was from the cold or from something else entirely. Go home, Robin. I didn't move. Priya knew me well enough not to push it twice. No ID, someone called from behind the curtain. No wallet, no phone. We've got nothing on him. Somebody find out who this man is, Dr. Aldretti said. It happened more than people think. A body arriving with no name attached to it. Most of the time we found one by morning. Some kind of relief always came with that. A person restored to themselves on paper, if nothing else. I stood in that hallway longer than I should have, watching the shapes move behind the curtain, rain still dripping off me onto the tile. I told myself I was making sure he was stable. That was true. It also wasn't the whole reason. A small television was mounted above the badge scanner by the doors, the local news playing on mute the way it always did overnight. I don't know why I looked up right then. Maybe I just wanted something ordinary to land on. For half a second, a photograph filled the screen behind the anchor's shoulder. A man in a grey suit at a podium. Something familiar in the set of his jaw, before the station cut to a commercial and the image was gone. I told myself it was nothing. My mind reaching for a pattern after a strange night. The way minds do, I still believe I would have let it go, gone home, slept it off. If Priya hadn't chosen that exact moment to pull the curtain back, catch my eye, and wave me over with a look on her face I'd never seen her wear before. "Robin," she said, "come look at this." I crossed to the nurse's station before I'd decided to move, my scrubs still dripping onto the tile behind me. and found Priya angling the little mounted television with 2 careful fingers, like she thought it might change its mind and disappear if she looked away. The segment had looped back around, the way overnight news does when nothing else is happening. Same anchor. A different clip this time, longer. A man at a podium in front of a building I didn't recognize. Camera flashes, catching off something. A caption crawled along the bottom, in letters too small to read from where I stood. And then it was gone, replaced by a graphic for tomorrow's forecast. "That's him," Priya said. "Tell me I'm wrong." I looked past her at the curtain, at the moving shapes behind it. "I don't know. Maybe." Robin. It was 2 seconds of a blurry photo at 4 in the morning. It could be anybody. I didn't believe that. And I don't think she did either, but neither of us said the rest of it out loud, which was that men don't usually turn up broken and nameless on a mountain road the same week their face is on. The news standing at a podium in a suit that cost more than either of our cars. Dr. Aldrete pulled the curtain back herself a few minutes later, stripping off a pair of gloves. "He's stable. Head laces closed, forearms a clean fracture, nothing internal that's showing yet. We'll keep imaging him through the morning." She glanced at me, not unkindly. "You can go home, Birch. You did good work out there. Does he have a name yet?" "He's not talking much. When he does, he's not saying who he is." She lowered her voice, the way you do when you're about to say something you're not supposed to say out loud in a hallway. "No insurance card, no wallet. Registration's got him down as a John Doe until that changes. Social work's already been paged for what it's worth." I knew what that meant. I'd watched it happen to other patients over the years. Cases went quieter once a social worker got involved instead of a family member. It wasn't unkind what the hospital did for people like that. It just wasn't the same as somebody showing up who loved you. Priya caught up with me at the coffee machine, arms crossed, giving me the look she'd been perfecting since nursing school. The one that meant she already knew what I was about to do before I did. "You're not leaving, are you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I have a shift tomorrow." "I should go home." "You should." "You're not going to." She poured a cup of the burnt break-room coffee neither of us actually liked and handed it to me instead of keeping it, the way she always did when she decided I needed it more than she did. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're being reckless. I think you're being you. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one from the inside. I just want to make sure he's okay before I go." "Sure." She smiled into her empty hands. "That's exactly what this is." I threw a balled-up napkin at her, and she laughed, and for a second the whole strange night felt almost ordinary. 2 friends standing in a break room instead of 2 women who just watched a man's careful anonymity nearly come apart on a muted television screen. I told myself I was leaving. I even got as far as the locker room, my hand on my bag. Before I turned around and walked back, he was awake when I came in, propped up against the pillows with a fresh bandage taped along his hairline. And something in his face changed when he saw me. Some of the guardedness easing just slightly. Like he recognized me even though we'd never really been introduced. "You're the one from the road," he said. His voice was rough but steadier than it had been. "I am." I stayed by the doorway, not wanting to crowd him. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a car." A ghost of something crossed his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that I felt it land somewhere in my chest. "I don't actually remember if that's what happened." "You don't remember the accident?" "I remember rain. I remember running." He looked down at his hands, turning them over like he was checking they still worked. "After that, it's mostly just you." I didn't know what to do with that, so I didn't do anything with it. "The nurses tell me you haven't given anyone your name." Something closed over his face again, quick, like a door someone remembered to shut. "It's easier if people don't know who I am right now." "Easier for who?" "For everyone." He said it like it cost him something. "You can call me Jack if you need to call me something." Jack. I tried it out. It didn't sound like a lie exactly, but it didn't sound like the truth either. "All right, Jack, I'm Robin." "Robin," he said my name like he was setting it down somewhere careful. "You didn't have to stop the car." "Yes, I did. Most people wouldn't have. Then most people are wrong. I meant it lighter than it came out. And for a second, neither of us said anything. The room quiet, except for the monitor keeping its steady rhythm beside him. "Can I ask you something?" he said after a while. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair." The corner of his mouth moved again. "Why'd you become a nurse?" It wasn't the question I expected. I'd braced for something about the accident, about what I'd seen, about whether I believed him when he said he didn't remember. Instead, he'd asked me something nobody in that hospital had bothered to ask me in longer than I could think of. "My grandmother got sick when I was 16, I said. "Nobody explained anything to us. The doctors talked past her like she wasn't in the room, and I decided somewhere in that hallway that I never wanted anybody to feel like that again, if I could help it." "Did it work? Not feeling like that anymore?" "Some days." I looked at him, this stranger with a stranger's name propped up in a hospital bed, asking me the kind of questions nobody usually bothered with. "Some days I still feel like that hallway, if I'm honest." He didn't say anything to that. He just looked at me like he was memorizing something, and I let him, because it had been a long time since anyone had looked at me quite like that. "Thank you," he said finally. "I don't know how to say it bigger than that, but I mean it as big as it gets." I told him to get some rest, and I left before I did something foolish, like believe I'd known this man my whole life, instead of 6 hours. Dale was asleep on the couch when I got home, one arm thrown over his face, a physics textbook open face down on his chest like it had lost a fight. I turned off the television he'd left running and pulled the blanket up over him the way I'd been doing since he was 14, and I was 23, and our mother's absence had turned me, without either of us really discussing it, into the person who did that kind of thing. He stirred enough to crack one eye open. "You're soaked. Long night. You're always having a long night." He said it without heat, just an observation, the kind siblings make about each other without meaning anything cruel by it. "There's mac and cheese in the fridge if you want it. I want a shower and 8 hours. In that order. Robin." He caught my wrist before I made it past the couch. The same gesture the man on the mountain had made a few hours earlier, though nothing else about it felt the same. "You okay?" "You've got to look. I'm fine. Found somebody hurt on the way home." Just a long shift on top of a long shift. He studied me a second longer than I wanted him to. The look a younger brother gives you once he's decided you're allowed to lie to him about being fine, but he's going to remember that you did it. "Okay, go shower." "You smell like a hospital." I was in the shower, water running hot enough to sting, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost didn't check it. I checked it anyway, because some part of me had been waiting for it since I walked out of that room. It was Priya, caseworker, just left. They're saying if nobody claims him and he can't cover charges, county placement by end of week. Thought you'd want to know. I read it twice, standing there dripping onto the bath mat, and I didn't have an answer for why my chest went tight the way it did. Why the thought of a stranger I'd known for 6 hours getting handed off to a shelter system that was already stretched thin felt like something I was personally supposed to prevent. I typed back, "End of week? Friday, probably. Sooner if a bed opens up, 4 days. I stood there a long time after that, long enough that the water ran cold, turning over a thought I didn't have any business turning over about a man whose real name I didn't even know. I didn't decide to offer him a place to stay so much as I ran out of reasons not to. That's the truth of it, even now. I'd like to tell you it was some grand moment of clarity, but it was smaller than that and slower, built out of 3 separate hospital visits over 4 days and a growing list of reasons that all led to the same conclusion. No matter how many times I tried to argue myself out of it, I went back the second day on my lunch break, still in scrubs, and found him sitting up doing the crossword from a newspaper someone had left behind, using the wrong hand because his dominant one was still in a splint. He looked up when I came in, and something eased in his shoulders that I was starting to recognize as specifically for me. 7 letters, he said, persistent in a good way, tenacious. That's 8, but he wrote it in anyway, counted the boxes. made it fit by cramming 2 letters into 1 square, and looked so pleased with the workaround that I laughed before I could stop myself. It was a small thing, a crossword filled in wrong on purpose, but it was the first time since the mountain that I'd seen him do anything just for the pleasure of it. And something about that settled into me sideways, the way small things sometimes do. You're in a good mood for a man who doesn't remember how he ended up on the side of a mountain. I've decided the doctor's right. No point being miserable about what I can't change. He set the paper down. Besides, good company today. I didn't know what to do with the way that landed, so I changed the subject. The way I'd been doing for 2 days, every time the conversation edged somewhere I didn't have a map for. The 3rd day, the hospital's caseworker cornered me in the hallway. A woman with tired eyes and a clipboard she held like a shield. "You've been visiting him," she said. It wasn't a question. I found him. I check in. He doesn't have anywhere to go, you know. No family we can locate, no ID, no funds, and the shelter placement we've got lined up. She stopped herself, choosing professionalism over honesty a beat too late to hide that she'd almost said something else. It's not ideal for a man in his condition. Overflow beds. No real medical follow-up capacity. What happens if nobody steps in? He goes anyway, Friday. She said it plainly, not cruelly, just the truth of a system with too many people and not enough places to put them. We do what we can. It isn't always enough. I thought about that walking back to my car that night. And I thought about it Thursday morning making coffee. And I thought about it Thursday afternoon when I should have been sleeping. And by Thursday evening, I'd stopped pretending I hadn't already made up my mind 3 days earlier and was only now catching up to myself. I found him packing what little he had into a plastic hospital bag, movements careful around the splint, and I stood in the doorway until he noticed me. "I have a spare room," I said before I could talk myself out of it. "It's not much, but it's better than a shelter cot with a broken arm and a head injury nobody's tracking properly." He went very still. "Robin, just until you're back on your feet. A few weeks, maybe. You'd be helping me, too, honestly. Dale's supposed to be handling more around the house, and he never does. So, I can't ask you to do that. You didn't ask." I offered. I made myself hold his eyes, even though it would have been easier not to. "I don't know what you're running from, Jack, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I know what happens to people the system loses track of. And I'm not going to be able to sleep knowing I could have done something and didn't." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might refuse, and some complicated feeling moved through me that I didn't examine too closely. Relief tangled up with something else. "All right," he said finally, and his voice had gone rough again. Though not from the injuries this time. "All right, thank you." Dale's reaction when I told him that night was about what I expected. "You're bringing home a guy you found on the side of the road. I'm bringing home a patient with nowhere else to go. That's not less concerning. Robin, he's got a broken arm and a head injury. He's not exactly dangerous. Famous last words of every true crime documentary ever made, but he said it grinning. Already resigned, already the same brother who'd once brought home a stray dog and argued for a week that it wasn't really a decision. It was just a fact that had already happened. Fine, but I'm keeping my door locked. Jack moved in on Friday afternoon. A duffel bag of donated clothes from the hospital's charity closet and a splint on his right arm, the only things he had to his name that anyone could see. He stood in my living room, looking at it the way you'd look at something you were afraid to touch too hard, in case it wasn't real. And when Dale offered him a hand to shake, he used the wrong one out of habit before catching himself and switching, apologizing twice for a mistake that didn't need one apology. "You cook?" Dale asked, because Dale's priorities were reliably simple. "I can make eggs," Jack said. "I used to be better at it. It's been a while since I made my own breakfast." Something about the way he said it, quiet and a little surprised at himself, told me there was a version of this man's life that had involved someone else making his eggs for a very long time, and that whoever that had been, they weren't in the picture anymore. He was careful in my house in a way that took me a few days to name. Careful with the furniture, careful with the food, careful about taking up space, like a man unused to being somewhere he hadn't paid for and wasn't sure of the rules. But underneath the carefulness, there were flashes of something else. The way he fixed the sticking cabinet hinge in the kitchen without being asked, hands sure even with the splint in the way. The way he tipped the pizza delivery driver more than the pizza cost, folding the bills without counting them first, like counting had never once mattered. The way he stood when I walked into a room, an old habit he seemed to catch himself doing and then couldn't quite stop. "You didn't have to do that," I told him after the driver left. "Do what?" "Tip like that. We're not exactly made of money around here." Something flickered across his face, there and gone. "Old habit," he said. "I'll watch it." I let it go, the way I'd been letting a dozen small things go all week, filing each one away without deciding yet what to do with the file. Because underneath the questions, something else was happening too, something I hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to stop even if I'd wanted to. I liked having him in the house. I liked the sound of him moving around in the kitchen in the mornings, careful and quiet, learning where I kept things. I liked the way he listened when Dale talked about his classes, actually listened, asking questions that showed he'd been paying attention. I liked, more than I wanted to admit, the way his eyes found mine across a room like he was checking I was still there. I noticed all of it and told myself none of it meant anything. The way you do when you're not ready yet to know what something means. It was Sunday night. A week after the storm, when I found him standing at the kitchen window with the lights off, looking out at nothing I could see. "You're allowed to tell me things," I said from the doorway. "I'm not asking. I'm just saying the door's open if you ever want to walk through it." He turned, and for a moment I thought he actually might. Something in his face opened up, raw and unguarded, in a way I hadn't seen yet. Like a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd been circling for days. "Robin." He said my name like it was the only steady thing in the room. "There's something you should probably know about me before this goes any further. I should have told you already. I think some part of me has been trying to figure out how, without losing the one good thing that's happened to me in longer than—" The front door banged open. Dale, home early from his study group, dropping his bag loud enough to announce himself from the hallway. "Anybody order pizza? I'm starving, and I already called it in, so say yes." By the time I looked back, whatever had been about to happen in that kitchen had folded itself up and put itself away. Jack was just a man rinsing a coffee mug again, the moment gone as quickly as it had opened. And I stood there wondering how long I'd have to wait before it opened again, and what exactly I was going to find on the other side of it when it finally did. The bill arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from the hospital to my address because I was the only address anyone had on file connected to him. And I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at a number with more zeros in it than I generally let myself think about at once. "How bad?" Jack asked from the doorway. He'd gotten steadier on his feet that week, the splint due to come off soon, color back in his face in a way that made it easier, most days, to forget how I'd found him. I turned the paper around so he could see it, mostly because I didn't have the heart to say the number out loud. He went quiet for a long moment. Then something in his jaw tightened. I was starting to recognize that particular tightness as him doing math he didn't like the answer to. "I'll figure out a way to pay it. I promise you that. I'm not worried about the money exactly." Which wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. "I'm worried about what happens with the follow-up care. The imaging, the PT for that arm, the neuro consult they wanted in 6 weeks. None of that happens without coverage, and you don't have coverage. And I don't know how you get coverage without a name. I'll get a job. Cash under the table, whatever I can find that doesn't ask too many questions. With a fractured arm and a head injury, they still want to monitor. Jack, be serious. I am being serious." He sat down across from me, and for once he didn't look away, didn't do the thing where his eyes slid off toward some middle distance whenever the conversation got too close to the truth of him. "I don't have a lot of options right now that don't involve becoming someone I used to be. And I'm not ready to be that person again. Not yet. I wanted to ask him what that meant. The way I'd wanted to ask 100 times over the past 2 weeks, and the way I had every time I let it go. Because some part of me understood that a man doesn't run from his own life without a reason big enough to justify running. It was Priya who said it first. 3 days later, though she said it as a joke, sitting cross-legged on my couch with a glass of wine, while Dale did homework at the kitchen table and Jack was out on the porch getting some air. "You know what would solve the insurance thing," she said, swirling her glass. "You could just marry him. Priya, I'm serious. Spousal coverage. You add him to your plan, he's covered within 30 days. The hospital gets paid, he gets his follow-up care. Everybody wins." She said it lightly, the way you say something you don't expect anyone to actually consider. I mean, obviously I'm kidding, mostly. I laughed it off the way I was supposed to. And then I lay awake that night doing math I hadn't let myself do out loud yet. The kind where you turn a ridiculous idea over and over, looking for the part that makes it stop being ridiculous. And you don't find it. And that's somehow the most unsettling part of all. The next evening, we sat on the back steps together, the first properly warm evening in weeks. Dale gone to a study group and the house quiet behind us. "Priya thinks I should marry you," I said. Before I'd decided to say it, because apparently that was becoming a pattern with this man, saying things to him I hadn't planned on saying, he went very still beside me. "What?" "For the insurance." It was a joke. Mostly a joke. I stared straight ahead at the yard, at Dale's abandoned bike leaning against the fence, anywhere but at him. But then I couldn't stop thinking about it because it's not actually a crazy idea, not the practical part of it. You'd get coverage. The hospital gets paid. You'd have an address, a name on paper, something to build from while you figure out whatever it is you're figuring out. Robin, I know how it sounds. It sounds, he said slowly, like the kind of thing a person only offers because they've got a heart too big for their own good. Don't make it about my heart. Make it about logistics. I finally looked at him. I'm not asking you to fall in love with me. Jack, I'm asking if a piece of paper might solve a problem that's actually solvable, instead of the two of us pretending it isn't there. He was quiet long enough that I started composing the version of this conversation where I took it all back, laughed it off the way Priya had, pretended none of us had been serious. If we did this, he said finally, I need you to know it wouldn't be nothing to me, even if it started as paperwork. I don't think I have it in me to treat you like paperwork, Robin. Not after everything you've already done. Okay, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Okay, let's think about it seriously. Not tonight, but seriously. He reached over, slow enough that I could have pulled away and didn't, and covered my hand with his on the step between us. The first time he'd touched me since the mountain, since his fingers had closed around my wrist in the rain, and he'd begged me not to tell anyone he existed. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I already trust you more than I've trusted anyone in longer than I want to admit. Whatever we decide, that part isn't paperwork. I need you to know that. I didn't pull my hand back. I sat there on the steps, with the evening going gold around us, and let myself, just for a moment, imagine a version of this that wasn't complicated, wasn't built on secrets and a name I still didn't know, and a debt neither of us could really afford. I told Dale 2 days later, catching him between classes at the kitchen table, because I didn't think I had it in me to say it to his face if I waited for the right moment. Since I was starting to suspect there wasn't going to be one. You're doing what? Marrying Jack for the insurance. It's not. I held up a hand before he could say anything else. It's not what it sounds like. It's practical. It solves a real problem. Robin. Dale set his pencil down very carefully, the way he did when he was trying not to say the first thing that came to mind. You've known this guy a month. I know. You don't know his real name. I know that too. And you're going to marry him. For the insurance, I said again. Like repeating it enough times might make it sound less insane out loud than it did in my own head. It's a piece of paper, Dale. It doesn't have to mean anything more than what we decide it means." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me in that way he had, the one that made me feel 16 again instead of 31. Like he could still see straight through whatever version of myself I was trying to present. "Does it feel like nothing to you?" "Because it doesn't look like nothing from where I'm sitting." I didn't have an answer for that, and my silence apparently told him everything he needed to know, because he sighed and reached over and squeezed my hand. The same gesture I'd been giving him since he was 14, handed back to me now that I needed it more. "Okay," he said. "I still think you're a little bit insane, but you've never once steered us wrong before, so I guess I'm not going to start doubting you now." "That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's the best I've got tonight." He picked his pencil back up, then set it down again. "Just don't let him break your heart, Robin. I don't think I could stand watching that happen to you. We didn't decide anything that night with Jack himself. But a few days after that, a collections agency called the house phone while I was still at work. Left a message brisk and impersonal, reading off an account number and a balance now marked overdue, threatening language buried politely inside professional phrasing. Dale played it for me twice the second I walked in. Both of us standing in the kitchen listening to a stranger's voice explain how much interest had already stacked onto that first bill. I called the number back once, just to confirm the total, and then I hung up and walked out to the porch where Jack was sitting with a mug of coffee, going cold in his hands. And I said the only thing I had left to say. "I think we need to do this, soon." He looked up at me, and whatever else was hiding behind his eyes, I watched him decide right there to let me see the relief. "Then let's do it soon," he said. "But Robin, whatever happens after this, I need you to remember that you asked me first, not the other way around. I need you to remember that part stayed true, no matter what else you find out." I didn't understand what he meant by that, not fully, not yet. I only knew that something in the way he said it settled into my chest like a promise and a warning at the same time, and that I was too far past turning back to ask him which one he'd meant it to be. The dress I wore to the courthouse wasn't a wedding dress. It was the navy one I'd bought for my cousin's graduation 2 years back. The only thing in my closet that didn't look like scrubs or grief. And I stood in front of my bedroom mirror on a Tuesday morning, trying to decide if that felt sad or just honest. Priya zipped me into it without being asked. Her fingers steady even though her face wasn't. "You don't have to do this. I know. I'm serious. Robin, if you want to back out, I will drive you anywhere else in the state right now. No questions. I know that too." I turned to face her, caught her hands before she could fuss with my hair again. "I'm not backing out because I'm scared. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, and because some part of me I haven't fully made peace with yet doesn't actually want to back out at all." She studied me a long moment, the way she'd studied 100 patients and a handful of friends, reading whatever it was she was looking for. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once, sharp, and picked the hairbrush back up. "Then let's get you married, I guess." I'd pictured my wedding 100 different ways over the years, the way most women do, half daydream and half armor against disappointment. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped picturing it at all, filed the whole idea away in the same drawer where I kept things I'd decided probably weren't going to happen to me. Standing there in a dress that wasn't a wedding dress, marrying a man for reasons that had nothing to do with the fairy tale version, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected. Not quite what I'd once imagined, but not nothing either. Dale drove us, quiet in a way that wasn't like him, both hands on the wheel like the county courthouse might get away from him if he loosened his grip. I caught him watching me in the rear view more than once. "You don't have to look so worried," I told him. "I'm not worried. I'm processing." He turned onto the courthouse street. "There's a difference, is there?" "Not really." "But it sounds better." I laughed despite myself. He'd driven me to my high school graduation in this same careful, white-knuckled way. 17 years old himself, and terrified of getting me there late because our mother had already missed too many of the things that mattered. Some habits outlast the reasons you built them. Some of the tightness in my chest eased. Just enough to get me through the courthouse doors. Foster was already waiting on the steps when we arrived. I'd met him twice before, both times brief, both times leaving me with more questions than I'd started with. He was somewhere in his 50s, built like a man who'd spent decades doing something that required him to stay useful with his hands. And he had a way of standing that made the space around him feel smaller, more organized, like a room automatically arranged itself once he walked into it. He'd shown up 2 days earlier with a garment bag and a leather folder and had disappeared into the guest room with Jack for the better part of an hour. And when they came back out, Jack was wearing a suit that fit him the way expensive things fit. And there was a folder of paperwork on the kitchen table that he'd quietly put away before I could get a good look at it. "You didn't have to dress up." I told him, Foster insisted. He'd looked almost embarrassed by it. Tugging at the cuff like the fabric itself made him uneasy. Said I couldn't marry you looking like I fell out of a moving car. His words. He's not wrong. He's rarely wrong. It's one of his more irritating qualities. I hadn't asked what was in the leather folder. I'd learned in the 2 weeks since the porch conversation that there were questions I could ask and questions that would have to wait, and I was trying, with mixed success, to be patient about which was which. Now, on the courthouse steps, Foster shook Dale's hand with a formality that seemed almost military, then turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Somewhere between approval and warning. "Mrs." He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "Robin, thank you for what you're doing. I'm not doing anything unusual." He needed help. I had a spare room. Something moved behind his eyes, gone before I could name it. "No, I don't imagine you think you are." He glanced toward the courthouse doors. "Shall we?" The ceremony itself took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind the officiant's head the whole time, partly to keep from crying and partly because looking at Jack too long made something in my chest feel too large for the room we were standing in. He held my hands through the whole thing, his thumb moving slow and steady over my knuckles, and when it came time to say the words, his voice didn't shake once, though mine did. Twice. The officiant was an older woman with kind eyes and the brisk efficiency of someone who'd done this exact ceremony 1,000 times and still managed to make it feel, for the 2 minutes it took her to say the words, like ours was the only one that had ever mattered. Roan. He stopped. The officiant looked up. Dale went very still beside me. I felt the word land in the room like something dropped from a height. Small but impossible to ignore. Jack, Roan, cleared his throat and started again. Steadier this time. His eyes locked on mine, like he was trying to hold me in place with them alone. "I, Roan, take you, Robin, to be my wife, for better or worse, for richer or poorer." Something that might have been a bitter kind of humor flickered at the corner of his mouth on that last part, gone before I could ask about it. "I promise to be honest with you. Even when honesty is the harder thing." I said my own vows back to him on autopilot, my mind still caught on the name, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you've stepped on, trying to figure out if it's sharp enough to have cut you. Roan, not Jack. Roan, it shouldn't have mattered. A name was just a name, and I'd known from the beginning that Jack wasn't real, had told myself it didn't matter what he called himself, as long as I understood the shape of who he actually was. But hearing it out loud, in that small, quiet room, in front of witnesses, felt different than knowing it in the abstract. It felt like the first true thing he'd given me, and I didn't know yet whether that made everything before it a lie, or just an incomplete version of the truth. There were no rings. We hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't had the money or the time to think about symbols when the practical need had outrun everything else. The officiant didn't seem to mind. She'd clearly seen every version of this ceremony there was to see. Rings and no rings, love and no love, and everything murky in between. And she pronounced us married with the same warm certainty either way. We signed where we were told to sign. I didn't let myself look too closely at the paperwork, at whatever last name sat beside that first one, because some part of me understood I wasn't ready for that yet. that I'd asked for a piece of paper and I was going to have to earn the right to ask for the rest of it. In the hallway outside the clerk's office, just for a moment it was only the two of us. Dale and Priya still gathering their things inside. He caught my hand before I could follow them out. Robin, his voice had dropped, urgent under the quiet. I know what you just heard. I know I owe you the rest of it. And I know not yet isn't a real answer to give a woman you just married. Then don't give me not yet. Give me something. Soon. He said it like a vow, separate from the one we'd just made, his thumb moving over my knuckles, the same way it had during the ceremony. I just need a little more time being a man you chose for himself. Before I'm a name in a headline you have to decide how to feel about. That's not me protecting myself from you. That's me trying to hold on to something honest a little longer before the rest of it changes. How you look at me. I wanted to push. Some part of me, the part that had been turning that single name over since the moment it left his mouth, wanted to plant my feet right there in that hallway and not move again until I had the whole truth. But I'd made a bargain with myself weeks earlier, the same bargain I was apparently still making, that whatever this man was hiding, he'd earned enough trust from me to be allowed to hide it a little longer. Soon, I repeated back to him, so he'd know I was holding him to it. He nodded and kissed my knuckles like the gesture could seal it. Before we walked back out to face Dale and Priya, the name still sitting unspoken and enormous in the space between us. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Dale hugged me hard enough to lift me half an inch off the ground, and Priya cried despite swearing she wouldn't. And for a few minutes, it almost felt like an ordinary kind of happy, the kind you're supposed to feel on your wedding day, uncomplicated by everything underneath it. Then Foster's phone rang, and I watched him step away to answer it. Watched his shoulders go rigid in a way that had nothing to do with military bearing and everything to do with whatever voice was on the other end of that call. He came back a few minutes later, his face arranged into something careful and blank, and touched Roan's elbow. A word when you have a moment. Now. Roan's voice had changed too. Some of the lightness from a minute ago already gone out of it. Now would be better than later. Something in the set of his shoulders made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't have a name for yet. Not quite fear, not quite anything else I recognized. Just the sense that somewhere out past the edges of this small, bright, uncomplicated morning, something larger was already moving. They stepped a few feet away, close enough that I could see them and far enough that I couldn't hear, and I stood there in my cousin's old graduation dress. Technically a married woman for the first time in my life, watching my husband's face change by degrees into an expression I hadn't seen on him yet, something that looked almost exactly like fear. Chapter 6. 3 weeks of marriage. Taught me things about Roan that had nothing to do with the questions I still hadn't asked him. I learned. He took his coffee black except on Sundays, when he let himself have cream. Like Sunday was the one day he allowed himself a small indulgence and rationed the rest of the week around it. I learned he read the last page of a book before the first, a habit he couldn't explain and didn't seem to want to. I learned he was a terrible liar about small things and a frighteningly good one about anything that mattered, which told me more about the life he'd left behind than anything he'd said to me directly. I learned the sound of his laugh, low and a little surprised at itself. Like laughing wasn't something he did often enough to have gotten used to it. I learned he was patient with Dale in a way that had nothing to do with performance, sitting through an entire dinner, listening to a rundown of thermodynamics homework, with what looked like genuine interest instead of practiced tolerance. I learned he still flinched, just slightly, every time the phone rang, though he never let it show past the second ring. I learned the two of us had fallen into a rhythm that felt less like two strangers sharing a house out of necessity and more like something else entirely. Something I didn't have a safe word for yet. I hadn't asked him about the name again. Roan. He'd promised me soon, in that courthouse hallway, and I'd promised him I'd hold him to it. And for 3 weeks, I watched that word stretch further than either of us had probably meant it to, and said nothing. because some part of me understood that pushing wouldn't make him ready any faster, only more afraid. Some nights I told myself that was patience, that I'd married a man for practical reasons and didn't need the rest of the story yet to keep the bargain we'd made. Other nights I lay awake, listening to him breathe in the room down the hall, counting the days since he'd made that promise, watching it grow heavier instead of lighter, the longer neither of us mentioned it, and wanted the truth so badly it felt like a physical thing lodged behind my ribs. Priya noticed before I let myself. She caught me watching him across the parking lot one evening, waiting to walk me to my car the way he'd started doing without either of us discussing it. And she bumped my shoulder with hers. "You're doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at him like he hung the moon and then pretend you were just checking the weather." She grinned into her coffee. "It's cute. Terrifying, given everything neither of us actually knows about him. But cute? It's not like that." "Sure it isn't." She didn't push it further, which was its own kind of mercy, and I drove home that night, turning her words over the same way I'd been turning over everything else I didn't want to examine too closely. I broke first. I always did, when it came to things I actually cared about. Dale used to tease me about it when we were kids, how I could hold my tongue about almost anything except the one thing that actually mattered to me. How I'd go quiet and reasonable about every small frustration and then crack wide open the moment something real was on the line. It was a Thursday, my day off, and I'd gone into work anyway to pick up a shift swap form. And I was sitting in the break room during my 10 minutes of stolen quiet when I finally did what I'd been telling myself for 3 weeks I wasn't going to do. I typed his name into my phone, Roan. Youngblood. The search results loaded before I'd fully processed what I was looking at. And then I was looking at all of it at once, a wall of headlines stacked one on top of the other going back years, and my coffee went cold in my hand while I scrolled. Youngblood Industries CEO missing 6 weeks. Board convenes emergency session, reclusive billionaire's disappearance sparks succession crisis at Huntsville aerospace giant. Where is Roan Youngblood? Family requests privacy. Amid search, there was a photo attached to the third article. The same photo I'd glimpsed on the hospital television the night I found him. A man in a grey suit at a podium, and underneath it, close enough now to read clearly, a caption confirming what some part of me had known for 3 weeks and refused to let myself believe. Founder and CEO of Youngblood Industries, valued at over $4 billion. I read the number twice, certain I'd misplaced a decimal point somewhere. The way you do with numbers too large to hold on to the first time. I hadn't. 4 billion, not 400,000, not 4 million. $4 billion, attached to a company whose headquarters I'd probably driven past 100 times without a second glance. Attached to a man who'd been sleeping 15 feet from my bedroom for 3 weeks. Eating cereal out of a chipped bowl because I hadn't gotten around to buying new ones. I sat very still for a long moment, the break room noise going distant and strange around me. Someone's laughter down the hall sounding like it was coming from underwater. $4 billion. I thought about the pizza tip he hadn't been able to help himself over, the way he'd stood when I walked into a room. The suit Foster had brought that fit him the way expensive things fit. Because of course it did, because it probably belonged to him already. Kept somewhere I'd never seen, waiting for a version of himself he'd been running from. I thought about our wedding. 11 minutes in a courthouse, me in my cousin's old graduation dress. Him promising to be honest with me, even when honesty was the harder thing. While an entire company searched for him and an entire family waited to hear if he was alive. He'd let me believe he had nothing. He'd let me offer him a spare room like it was charity. Let me worry over collections calls and hospital bills like they mattered to a man who could have paid them 1,000 times over without noticing the withdrawal. I don't remember driving home. I remember standing in my own kitchen with my keys still in my hand, and Roan looking up from the stove where he was, absurdly, unbearably making eggs. And something on my face must have told him everything before I said a single word. "Robin," he set down the spatula. "What happened?" $4 billion. My voice came out strange, flat, not like my own. That's what happened. He went very pale, and for a moment neither of us moved, the eggs burning slowly behind him, while the whole architecture of the last 6 weeks rearranged itself in the space between us. "I can explain," he said. "Can you? Because from where I'm standing it looks pretty simple. You told me soon, in a courthouse hallway, and you let 3 weeks go by without so much as circling back to it. You let me think you had nothing. You let me feel sorry for you. You let me marry you for insurance while I was worried about paying rent. And this whole time you could have ended it with a phone call. It's not that simple, and you know it isn't. Or you wouldn't still be standing in that doorway instead of walking out of it. That stopped me. Because it was true, and I hated that it was true. Hated that even now. Furious and blindsided, and made a fool of in front of an entire company's worth of headlines I hadn't known to look for. Some part of me was still standing there waiting to hear the rest of it instead of already gone. "Then explain it," I said. "Right now." All of it he didn't argue. He didn't reach for excuses the way I half expected. The practiced deflections of a man used to handling boards and reporters and people who wanted things from him. He just looked for a moment, like every kind of tired I'd ever seen on a patient's face combined into one. The specific exhaustion of a person who's been carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down feels almost as frightening as continuing to carry it. He came around the counter slowly, like a man approaching something that might still bolt, and reached for my hands the way he had on our wedding day. And I let him take them, even though I told myself I shouldn't. "My name is Rowan Youngblood," he said. "I run a company my grandfather built with a single hangar and a government contract in 1961. 6 weeks ago, I disappeared from my own life because 3 people I trusted more than almost anyone on earth spent years teaching me that trust was a mistake. And when the 3rd one finally broke me, I got in a car in the rain, and I drove until I couldn't drive anymore. And then apparently I got out and walked, and then you found me. That's not an explanation. That's a headline. I know." His hands tightened around mine. "I know I promised you soon, and let 3 weeks turn into something else instead. The real explanation is longer and it's uglier, and some of it is going to make you angrier than you already are. But I'd rather tell you all of it right now tonight than lose you over the parts I was too much of a coward to say sooner." I looked at this man I'd married 11 minutes into a Tuesday, this stranger with a fortune I couldn't fully picture the size of, standing in my kitchen in a shirt that had definitely come from somewhere far more expensive than the charity closet where I'd first seen him dressed. And I made a decision I wasn't at all sure was the right one. "Sit down," I said. "Start from the beginning. And Rowan, don't you dare leave anything out." He talked for a long time before either of us moved from the kitchen table, the eggs long since gone cold and forgotten in the pan behind him. I made fresh coffee at some point without really deciding to, my hands needing something to do while my ears did the harder work of listening. And I set a mug in front of him that he didn't touch for a long time. "Her name was Ivy," he said. "Crane before she was almost a Youngblood. We were together 4 years. I asked her to marry me on a Tuesday in April at the Overlook up on Montesano, because I thought it was the kind of thing you should do somewhere with a view." He turned his coffee mug slowly on the table, not drinking from it, just needing something to do with his hands. "I found out 3 months before the wedding that she'd been seeing someone else for most of that year. A magazine got hold of it before I did, actually. That's how I found out. My assistant handed me a phone with the headline already loaded. I'm sorry. I used to think that was the worst of it. Finding out from a stranger's phone screen instead of her mouth." Something moved across his face, old pain worn smooth at the edges from handling. "It wasn't the worst of it. Not by a long way. It was just the first. I don't hate her, if that's what you're waiting to hear," he added, like he could see the question forming before I'd asked it. "I used to. For a while, I wanted to hate her so badly it felt like the only thing keeping me upright. But hating her would mean admitting how much of what happened was actually about me. about how little of myself I'd actually shown her in 4 years, because I was always so certain that if people saw all of me, actually all of me, they'd find a reason to leave. What was the worst of it? Ingrid. He said the name like it cost him something different than Ivy's had, something closer to respect even now. She and I built this company back up together after my father died. She was brilliant, sharper than I've ever been about the actual mechanics of the business, the parts I was never as good at as everyone assumed I'd be just because of my last name. I made her COO the day I could, and I still don't think it was enough, not really, not for what she'd earned. What happened? A competitor made her an offer. Better title, better money, her name on the door instead of buried 3 lines down in a press release under mine. He shook his head slowly. I don't even blame her for wanting it. I blame her for the way she left. She took 4 years of proprietary engineering data with her on the way out, and it cost us a defense contract worth more than most people see in a lifetime, and when I confronted her about it, she looked at me and said I'd never once made her feel like an equal partner instead of an employee I was generous to. And Robin, she wasn't entirely wrong. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights. She wasn't entirely wrong, and she still cost us everything anyway. There's a version of that story where I'm just the villain, he added quietly. Where a woman built half of something with her own 2 hands and got pushed to the margins of it anyway. No matter how many titles I gave her, because at the end of the day, my last name was still the one on the building. I think about that version more than I let on. I thought about Ivy Crane and her view of forever from a mountain overlook, about Ingrid Barlow and her years of being almost enough, and something in my own chest ached on their behalf, even while I understood, watching Roan's face while he told it. Exactly how much both of those women had cost him, it struck me sitting there, that he hadn't told either story like a man building a case against the women who'd hurt him. He'd told them like a man still trying to be fair to people who'd stopped being fair to him a long time ago. And I found myself wondering what that kind of grace had cost him to hold on to, and whether I'd have been generous enough to hold on to it myself. And the third, I said quietly, the one who finally broke you. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. My stepmother, Arlene. His voice had gone rougher than it had been for either of the other 2 names. She's not a bad person, not really, not the way you're picturing right now. She's terrified. She's been terrified since my father died and left the company to me instead of splitting it with her son, my half-brother. And she spent 5 years convinced I'm 1 bad quarter away from losing everything her son should have inherited instead. What did she do? He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how much of this belonged to him to tell and how much belonged to her. She used to send me birthday cards signed from both of them, her and my half-brother, every year, even after everything between us went cold. I don't think she's ever stopped loving my father, even though he's been gone 5 years. I think some of what she's doing now, she's doing because she genuinely believes she's protecting the only piece of him she has left. That doesn't make it right, but it's not nothing either. 6 weeks ago, I found some irregularities in a set of financial reports. Numbers that didn't add up, transfers I couldn't account for. I started asking questions. I didn't get far before I found myself in the rain on a mountain road. And I still don't fully understand how those 2 things connect, only that they must, because the timing is too clean to be anything else. He looked up at me, and the fear I'd seen on the courthouse steps was back in his face, unmistakable now that I knew what I was looking at. Foster's been quietly looking into it since the day you found me. He came to see me at the courthouse because he finally had something. What kind of something? Traffic footage from a private security camera near the overlook. It doesn't show a random accident, Robin. His hands had gone still on the table, all their earlier restlessness burned away by whatever he was about to say next. Someone else's headlights were behind mine for almost 2 miles before I went off that road. Whoever it was never called it in. Never stopped. The kitchen went very quiet. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own pulse suddenly loud in my ears. You're telling me someone did this to you on purpose. I'm telling you, Foster thinks so. And Foster is very rarely wrong. What does that mean? What do we do with that? For now, nothing rash. Foster's pulling financial records, phone logs, anything that might connect the timing to someone specific. It's slow. It's careful. It has to be. Because if whoever did this realizes we're looking, they'll bury whatever's left to find. His jaw tightened. I hate it. I want to walk back into that building tomorrow and demand answers from everyone who might have had a reason. Foster's right that it would likely accomplish nothing except warning them. He reached for my hand again, and this time I let him take it without hesitating. Some instinct in me choosing him before the rest of me had finished deciding to. I don't know who yet. I don't know if it's connected to Arlene or to something else entirely, or to some part of my life I haven't even thought to look at. But I know it wasn't an accident, and I know that whoever it was still doesn't know I survived. And I know that the longer this stays hidden, the harder it gets to ever prove. I sat there holding my husband's hand across a table with 2 plates of cold, forgotten eggs between us, married to a man worth $4 billion, whose real name I'd known for exactly 1 day, and understood with a clarity that steadied me more than it frightened me, that I was already in this too deep to walk away, even if walking away had still been on the table. Then we find out who, I said. Together. Not you disappearing into whatever version of yourself you think you have to become to survive this. Together, Roan. That's the only way I'm doing this. He looked at me like I'd handed him something he hadn't let himself hope for in longer than he could say. Together. He agreed. He lifted my hand and pressed his mouth to my knuckles. The same gesture from our wedding day, except this time it didn't feel like a formality performed for witnesses. It felt like a promise being remade on purpose, with everything now finally out in the open between us, for whatever that promise was actually going to turn out to be worth. Foster called before 8 the next morning, and I knew from the way Roan's whole body went still, while he listened, that whatever Foster was telling him mattered more than anything that had come before it. He hung up and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment before he spoke. One hand braced against the frame like he needed it to stay upright. They found him, he said. Perry Colston, company controller under Ingrid, promoted to CFO after she left. Foster pulled gas station footage from a camera 2 miles down the mountain from where you found me. Perry's car. Time-stamped 11 minutes before the accident report. That's not proof he ran you off the road, no, but combined with the financial irregularities I'd been asking him about for 2 weeks before I disappeared, and combined with the fact that he moved $60,000 out of a shell account 4 days after I vanished, assuming I was either dead or never coming back to check the books again. He shook his head. It's enough for Foster to be certain. It's enough for me to be certain. So what happens now? Now we have a problem. He crossed to the table, pulled out his phone, showed me an email that had come in overnight. Arlene's called an emergency board session for tomorrow morning. A vote to formalize her petition of incapacity on the grounds that 6 weeks of unexplained absence constitutes abandonment of fiduciary duty. If it passes, I lose the company. Not eventually, tomorrow. Can they actually do that? You're alive. You're right here. They don't know that yet. As far as the board knows, I'm still missing. Something hardened in his face, the softness of the last few weeks giving way to something I hadn't seen since the courthouse steps. Which means, tomorrow morning, I walk into that boardroom and I stop being missing. I felt my stomach drop, though I wasn't sure yet if it was fear or something closer to pride. I'm coming with you, Robin. You said together. You don't get to take that back now just because it's inconvenient. I held his gaze until he looked away first, which he did, eventually, the ghost of something that might have been relief crossing his face. Together, Roan. All the way through. Youngblood Industries occupied 11 floors of glass and steel downtown. The kind of building I'd driven past 100 times without ever once imagining I'd walk through its doors. let alone walk through them, married to the man whose name was etched into the lobby directory. The receptionist did a double take that would have been funny under any other circumstances. Foster, already waiting for us with two men I didn't recognize flanking him, didn't so much as blink. "They're seated," he said. "Started 4 minutes ago." "Good," Rowan said. "Let's not keep them waiting any longer than we have to." The boardroom was on the top floor, all glass walls and a view of the mountain I'd found him on, which felt like something out of a story too neat to be real. Except it wasn't a story. It was just where we happened to be standing. When Rowan pushed open the doors and every single person at that long table turned to look at us, I have never in my life witnessed silence land quite the way it landed in that room. Woman at the head of the table, silver hair, sharp suit, a face that had clearly practiced composure for decades and still couldn't quite hold it in that moment. Half rose from her chair. One hand pressed flat against her chest. "Roan," her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Oh, thank God, you're alive." I understood, watching her face, that this had to be Arlene. And I understood, watching the genuine shock and relief written across every line of her, that whatever else was true about her, she had not expected this, had not, perhaps, wanted this outcome nearly as much as the rest of the story suggested she should have. Roan didn't look at her yet. His eyes had already found the man 3 seats down, a compact man in his 40s, with thinning hair and a stillness that looked like it was taking everything he had to hold. "Perry," Roan said. "You look surprised to see me." "I'm relieved," Perry said, too fast. His voice pitched higher than it should have been. "We've all been worried sick." "Have you?" Roan set a folder down on the table, the one Foster had handed him in the elevator. "Then you won't mind explaining the $60,000 that moved out of the Meridian account 4 days after I disappeared? Or the gas station footage that put your car on the mountain road 11 minutes before I went off it?" The room went from silent to something else entirely. A dozen conversations breaking out at once, and Perry's face went through 3 or 4 different expressions faster than I could track them, landing finally on something raw and cornered that had nothing left to perform. "You don't understand," he said. "I didn't mean for it to. I was going to talk to you, I swear. I just wanted to explain before you looked too closely, and then you wouldn't slow down, and I panicked. I just needed you to stop the car. I never meant for—" He was on his feet by the end of it, chair scraping back hard enough to fall, and for one terrible second I thought he might actually run, might shove past the 2 men Foster had brought and disappear down whatever hallway led fastest to an exit. His breathing had gone ragged, fast and shallow, one hand pressed hard against his own chest. And I recognized the panic in his eyes, even through the fear, the same look I'd seen on 100 patients mid-crisis. A body flooding itself with adrenaline it had nowhere to send. I moved, before I'd fully decided to, crossing the room fast, my hand landing on his arm, gently but firmly enough to anchor him. "Perry, look at me." My voice came out in the register I used in the ER. Calm and certain, the voice that had talked 100 frightened people through the worst moments of their lives. "You're having a panic attack. I need you to breathe with me. In for 4 counts. Can you do that?" "I can't." "You can." "In for 4. I held his eyes, ignored the chaos of the room around us, ignored my own husband standing 8 feet away, watching me with an expression I didn't have time to read yet. 4, 3, 2, 1. "Now hold it. Now out slow, 6 counts. He fought me for a moment, his whole body rigid with panic, and then something in him gave way, his breathing catching the rhythm I was setting, his knees buckling enough that Foster's men caught him under the arms and eased him into a chair instead of letting him fall. "You're okay," I told him, quieter now. "You're not dying. This is fear, and fear passes. Just breathe." I don't know how long I stood there, one hand still on his arm, walking a man who had tried to kill my husband through the worst panic attack of his life, except that I did know, actually. I knew exactly why I was doing it. Because some things about who you are don't change, depending on who's in front of you. Because the same instinct that had pulled me out of a ride share into a rainstorm for a stranger didn't have a clause in it that only applied to strangers who deserved it. By the time security arrived, real police alongside Foster's men, Perry had gone quiet, defeated. His breathing evened out enough that I stepped back and let them do their work, cuffing his hands in front of him with a gentleness that felt almost absurd given everything he'd done. He looked back once, on his way out, not at me, but at Arlene, still frozen at the head of the table. "Ask her," he said, "why she never once tried very hard to find you. Ask her what she knew and when." Then he was gone, and the room exhaled all at once, and I turned to find Rowan already crossing the space between us, his hands finding my face like he needed to confirm I was real. "You just talked down the man who tried to kill me," he said, something wrecked and amazed in his voice at once. "I talked down a man having a panic attack. That's different, is it?" He pressed his forehead to mine, right there in front of the entire board, in front of Arlene, in front of everyone. "Robin, I've spent 6 weeks running from every version of trust I ever had. And you just stood in the middle of the worst morning of my life and chose compassion anyway, for a man who didn't deserve an ounce of it. And I don't have the words for what that does to me. I love you. I don't know when it happened exactly. I only know it's true, and I'm done being too much of a coward to say it." The boardroom had gone quiet around us again, a different kind of quiet this time, and somewhere behind me I heard Arlene's voice, thin and shaking. "Rowan, please, I need to talk to you. There are things I need you to understand before you decide how much to hate me." He didn't let go of my hand, but he turned finally to face her, and whatever was about to happen next, I understood we weren't done yet. Not by a long way. Arlene's office overlooked the same mountain everything else in this story seemed to circle back to, and she stood at the window with her back to us for a long moment before she found the words to start. "I didn't know," she said, "about the crash. I need you to believe that. Even though I understand you have no reason to, then tell me what you did know." Rowan's voice was steady, but I could feel the tension in his hand where it still held mine, because Perry seemed very sure I should ask. She turned, and I watched 5 years of careful composure crack open all at once, leaving something much older and more frightened underneath it. "Perry came to me 9 days after you disappeared. He told me you'd been erratic for weeks before that. Paranoid, he said, making wild accusations about financial mismanagement that didn't hold up under scrutiny. He said he was worried you were having some kind of breakdown, and that the kindest thing, the safest thing, for the company and for you, would be to formalize a leave of absence before you did something that couldn't be undone. And you believed him." I wanted to believe him. Her voice broke on the admission. "Do you understand what that's like, Rowan? To want so badly for a story to be true that you stop asking the questions that would prove it false. He gave me a version of events where protecting you and protecting my son's future were the same action. And I was so hungry for permission to do the second thing that I let myself believe the first. You could have called me. Looked for me yourself instead of trusting his version of things. I tried." Something fierce moved through her voice for the first time. "I hired someone the second week quietly because I didn't want it to look like I doubted the story Perry had given the rest of the board. He came back with nothing. I didn't know then that Perry had access to the same investigators' reports before I did, that he'd been managing what I saw and when I saw it since almost the beginning." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "I was so certain I was protecting my son from losing everything his father meant for him to have. I never once let myself imagine I might be helping bury you instead." The room was quiet for a long moment, just the hum of the building around us. The mountain sitting patient and unbothered outside the window, the way it had been sitting there since long before any of us were born to complicate it. "I don't forgive you," Rowan said finally. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. What you did nearly cost me everything. And I need you to understand that before we go any further. I understand, but I also don't think you're the villain in this the way I spent the last 6 weeks believing you were. He let go of my hand long enough to cross the room, stopping a few feet from her. Close enough that I watched her flinch slightly, bracing for something. He didn't raise his voice. You were scared, and someone smarter and crueler than both of us used that fear as a weapon. That doesn't erase what it cost, but it's not the same as cruelty. And I think some part of me needs it not to be the same. Because I don't know how to keep hating you and also keep loving what's left of my father in you. Arlene made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, pressing both hands over her face, and Roan stood there and let her have the moment instead of filling it with more words, which struck me as its own kind of grace, the quiet mercy of not needing to be thanked for offering it. I stood a little apart from both of them, watching a family try to rebuild something that had nearly come apart entirely, and I thought about my own mother, gone more years now than she'd ever actually been present, and how differently this might have gone if she'd ever once been willing to sit in a room and simply say she was sorry. Some families get that chance, some don't. I found myself glad, fiercely and unexpectedly, that this one still could. It took another 6 weeks to sort out everything that followed, though none of it happened as dramatically. As that morning in the boardroom, Perry pleaded guilty to embezzlement and reckless endangerment rather than risk a trial where the traffic, footage and financial records would speak for themselves in front of a jury. The DA's office told us privately they'd wanted to pursue an attempted murder charge, but couldn't prove intent beyond panic. That a man fleeing a confrontation who happened to run someone off a mountain road was a different animal, legally, from a man who'd planned to kill. I understood the distinction, even as some part of me struggled against it. Perry hadn't meant to end a life. He'd meant to protect himself. And Roan's survival had been luck, not mercy. And somehow that made the whole thing both easier and harder to hold at once. The board reinstated Roan unanimously the same week the story broke publicly. Youngblood Industries' CEO, found alive, splashed across every outlet that had spent 6 weeks running the opposite headline. Reporters found their way to our street within days, and I learned quickly what it meant to have a life that other people felt entitled to a piece of. Cameras outside the house, questions shouted from the sidewalk. A version of scrutiny I'd never once had to think about before the mountain. Dale thought the whole thing was hilarious, at least at first, forwarding me screenshots of tabloid headlines speculating about the mystery nurse who'd married a billionaire, until the day a photographer caught him leaving Calhoun and ran his photo captioned, "Brother or bodyguard," at which point his sense of humor about the situation dropped considerably. Priya fielded 3 separate offers from local news stations wanting the inside story from the best friend, and turned down every one of them without asking me first, which told me more about what our friendship actually meant to her than almost anything she could have said out loud. Roan handled the press the way he seemed to handle most things now, directly, without flinching. Though I watched it cost him something every time. "I'm sorry," he told me one night, after a reporter had followed me all the way to the grocery store parking lot with a camera. "This isn't the life I promised you when we signed that paperwork for the insurance. You didn't promise me a life. You promised me honesty." I leaned into him on the couch, tired in a way that had nothing to do with a hospital shift for the first time in longer than I could remember. "I'm still getting that. Everything else we figure out as we go, as we go." He pressed a kiss into my hair. I liked the sound of that more than I probably should. Arlene came to the house 3 weeks after the boardroom, alone without calling first, and stood on the porch with her hands twisted together like a woman half expecting the door to be shut in her face. "I don't expect forgiveness today," she said when I opened it. "I only wanted you to know I understand what you did for this family, showing up the way you did, for a man who had every reason to expect nobody ever would again. I don't think I've properly thanked you for that. You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to." She looked past me, toward the kitchen, where I could hear Roan moving around. and something in her face softened into something almost hopeful. "I'd like to, anyway. If you'll let me stay long enough to try." I stepped back and held the door open because some things I was learning mattered more than being owed an apology exactly the way you'd pictured receiving it. She stayed 2 hours that first visit, stiff and careful at first, then slowly less so, and by the time she left, Ron walked her to her car and stood on the sidewalk a long time after her taillights disappeared, his hands in his pockets, something working itself loose in his shoulders that had been locked there for longer than the 6 weeks he'd been missing. "You okay?" I asked when he came back inside. "I think so." He pulled me into him, chin resting on top of my head the way it had started to, a habit I hadn't noticed forming until it was already there. I spent 6 weeks convinced I could never trust anyone with my name in this family again. Turns out I just needed to stop confusing being hurt with being right about who deserved a second chance. That's a very generous thing to learn. I had a good teacher. He tipped my chin up, kissed me slow and unhurried, no boardroom watching, no crisis pressing at the edges of it, just the two of us in a kitchen that had somehow become the center of both our lives. Speaking of which, I believe I owe you a wedding. A real one this time. No courthouse, no 11 minutes, no signing something just to keep the lights on. I liked our courthouse wedding. I liked it too. I'd still like to give you the other kind if you'll let me. He smiled, and for the first time since the mountain, it reached all the way to his eyes, unguarded and certain. Everyone we love, in one place, saying it out loud instead of signing it in a hurry. "What do you say, Mrs. Youngblood?" I said yes, before he'd even finished the question. We got married again on a Saturday in October, 6 months after the first time, and this time I wore an actual wedding dress. 6 months is not a long time. Not really, not when you measure it against a whole life. But it had been long enough to watch Roan learn how to sit in a boardroom without flinching. Long enough for Dale to finish his degree and start a job he was embarrassingly proud of. Long enough for Arlene to become, against every expectation I'd walked into that boardroom with, someone I looked forward to seeing on Sunday afternoons. Priya had picked the dress out herself, dragging me to 4 different shops over 2 Saturdays, until she found the one that made her go quiet instead of critical, which she informed me was the only test that actually mattered. Standing in the dressing room mirror that final Saturday, seeing myself in white lace instead of my cousin's old navy dress, I'd had to sit down for a minute, overwhelmed by a feeling I didn't have tidy words for even now. Priya cried before the ceremony even started, which she'd sworn up and down wouldn't happen twice. And Dale walked me down an aisle that ran the length of the overlook on Montesano, the same spot where Roan had once planned to propose to someone else entirely, reclaimed now for something neither of us had expected to survive long enough to have. "You sure about this?" Dale asked, low, just for me, his arm steady under my hand. "I've never been more sure of anything." "Good." He grinned. The same grin he'd worn since he was 14 and decided a stray dog wasn't a decision so much as a fact that had already happened. Because there's about 200 people out there, and I don't think you could back out gracefully at this point, even if you wanted to. 200 people. I still couldn't quite believe it, standing at the top of that aisle, looking out over folding chairs that ran all the way to the tree line. Most of the faces belonging to people I'd only met in the last 6 months. Hospital colleagues and Youngblood Industries employees, and a handful of Huntsville locals who'd apparently decided our story belonged to the whole town now, not just to us. Dr. Aldrete sat near the back in a hat, far more extravagant than anything I'd ever seen her wear, to a 12-hour shift. And when she caught my eye, she pressed both hands to her heart, mouthing something that looked like "about time." The caseworker from Crestview, who'd once warned me about county placement deadlines, had come too, at my own insistence, because some debts you don't forget, even after the crisis that created them, has long since passed. Foster stood near the front in a suit that fit him exactly the way it had the first time, though his face, when I caught his eye, had softened into something I hadn't seen on him before, something almost like pride. Arlene sat in the second row, her hand tucked into her son's arm, both of them present at Roan's specific invitation. A decision that had taken us 3 long conversations to reach and still felt. On this morning, like exactly the right one, I found Roan waiting at the end of the aisle, and every rehearsed thought I'd had about this moment left my head at once, replaced with just him, steady and certain in a way the broken man on the mountain never could have imagined becoming. The clouds had been threatening rain all morning, grey and heavy over the ridge, and somewhere in the last few steps of that aisle, the first drops started falling, light and warm. Nothing like the storm that had started all of this. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for an umbrella. Bria laughed out loud from her seat, and it spread through the crowd the way laughter does when it means something more than the joke. And Roan reached for my hands the way he had in that courthouse 6 months earlier. Except this time, there was nothing practical left in the gesture at all. "I believe you owe me a proper set of vows," I told him, rain catching in my lashes. The first ones were a little short on poetry. I've had 6 months to work on it. He laughed, low and unguarded, the sound I'd fallen in love with somewhere in a kitchen full of burnt eggs and hard truths. "Robin Birch, you stopped a car in the middle of the worst storm of your life for a stranger who gave you nothing but a fake name and a mountain of trouble. You gave me shelter when you had every reason not to, and honesty when I'd forgotten how to offer it back. And you stood in a boardroom and chose compassion for a man who'd nearly destroyed us both. Because that's simply who you are, all the way down, whether the moment calls for it or not. I have $4 billion and a company with my grandfather's name on it, and none of it, not one single dollar of it, means anything next to the fact that you would have loved me exactly the same if I'd been telling the truth from the very beginning. I was born into an empire. You built a home. I know now which one I actually needed. I didn't trust my voice for a long moment. The rain and the crowd and 6 months of fear and hope all catching up to me at once. I didn't marry you for shelter, I finally said. Not really. Not even that first time, if I'm honest with myself. I married a man I'd known for 6 weeks because some part of me already knew there was nothing fake about the way he looked at me. Even when everything else about him was a lie, he was still learning how to put down. I love the man who fixes cabinet hinges without being asked. I love the man who reads the last page of a book first, because he spent his whole life needing to know how the story ends before he can let himself enjoy it. I love you, Roan Youngblood. Not the empire, not the name in the lobby directory. Just you. That's who I said yes to on a Tuesday in a courthouse. And that's who I'm saying yes to now, in front of everyone, in the rain. Exactly the way it should have happened the first time. Somewhere behind me, I heard Dale make a sound, halfway between a laugh and a sob. And Priya wasn't even pretending to hold back tears anymore, and even Foster, I would learn later, had needed a moment to compose himself before the ceremony's end. The officiant, a different one this time, older and unhurried, said the words that made it official, and when Roan kissed me, the whole crowd rose to its feet at once, 200 people cheering into the rain on a mountain that had once nearly taken everything from both of us and had somehow, instead, given us each other. Dale hugged me so hard he lifted me clean off my feet, laughing and crying at the same time, and Priya threw her arms around both of us. And somewhere in the crowd I saw Arlene dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. Her son had passed her. And Foster, stern, unshakable Foster, actually smiled wide and real, like a man who'd finally set down something heavy he'd been carrying since a rainy night on a mountain road. The reception ran long into the evening. String lights strung between the trees at the edge of the overlook. A band Roan had hired playing everything from old soul standards to whatever song Dale kept requesting, until they finally gave in. And at some point during the dancing, I looked around at all of it. The mountain and the lights, and the 200 people who'd shown up to watch two strangers who'd found each other in a storm become something permanent, and understood that this, more than any boardroom or any headline, was what it actually looked like to build a life instead of simply surviving one. Later, After the toasts and the dancing and the enormous cake, Dale had insisted on personally approving. Drone pulled me away from the reception for a few minutes, back to the overlook. Empty now except for the two of us and the last grey light of evening. Regretting the rain? He asked, nodding at my ruined hem. Not for 1 second. I leaned into him, watching the valley spread out below us, lights coming on one by one in a town that had somehow become mine, without my quite noticing when it happened. I found you in a storm. It felt right to marry you in one too, somewhere down the mountain. The string lights were still glowing between the trees, the music still playing, for a crowd that would eventually notice we'd slipped away and forgive us for it. But up here, for just a few minutes, it was only the two of us and the mountain and the same rain that had started everything. And I found I didn't want to rush back down to the party just yet. Not when I finally had exactly what I'd been chasing without knowing it since the night I stopped. A car in a storm, for a stranger who turned out to be worth every risk I never knew I was taking. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, chin resting on top of my head, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, because some things I was learning didn't need to be said out loud to be true. "Thank you," he said finally, "for stopping the car." "Thank you," I said back, "for being worth stopping for." A note from Mr. Peter, my beautiful queen flowers. Family of mine, I want to sit with you for a moment before we close this story, because I believe with my whole heart that Robin and Roan's journey has something real to say to every one of us, whether our own storms have already passed or whether we're still standing in the middle of them tonight. The first lesson is this: kindness given without expecting anything in return is the truest measure of a person's character. Robin stopped that car not knowing who she was helping or what it would cost her. She gave shelter to a stranger because it was the right thing to do, not because she calculated what she might gain from it. Queen flowers, that is the kind of heart the Lord asks us to carry through this life. Not calculating, not keeping score, just willing in the moment it matters to stop the car. The second lesson is this: real wealth was never about the money in the account. It's about the people who choose to stay when staying costs them something. Roan had $4 billion, and not one soul he trusted enough to tell the truth. It took a nurse with an overdue credit card bill to teach him what actual riches looked like. The third lesson, and perhaps the hardest one, is this: healing from betrayal does not mean closing your heart forever. It means learning slowly and carefully to recognize the difference between the people who hurt you and the one person who finally, patiently, proves themselves worthy of what's left. Roan carried 3 betrayals into that hospital room. He walked out of this story with a family instead, because he let himself try again. And the fourth lesson, family, is one I hope you'll carry with you long after this video ends. The truth, however frightening, is always a stronger foundation than the most comfortable lie. Robin could have walked away when she learned who Roan really was. Instead, she asked for the whole truth, sat through every uncomfortable word of it, and chose him anyway with open eyes instead of closed ones. That is what real love looks like. Not blind, wide awake and choosing anyway. Thank you for spending this time with me, my beautiful family. Until the next story, may you stop for the ones who need you. May you tell the truth even when it costs you something, and may you always believe that your own storm is not the end of your story. I love each and every one of you. This is Mr. Peter signing off.